Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 17 of the Secunda Secundae of St. Thomas Aquinas. We are looking at a new section here, hope in itself. We have a very short section with only 5 questions. Hope only gets 5 questions, but some of them are rather long, like this one with 8 different articles. So let's just jump right into the theological virtue of hope. So the first question is hope a virtue? Which, since it's a theological virtue, we can kind of guess what St. Thomas is going to say about that. So he says, hope trusts in the divine essence for obtaining happiness. That's kind of his unofficial definition of what hope is. It's aiming at eternal happiness, and it's doing it through divine assistance, right? So that's the theological virtue of hope, the definition. St. Thomas says this many times, but wherever we find a good human act, it must correspond with some human virtue. Now, this is going to be true of prudence, it's going to be true of justice, it's going to be true of every virtue. Where you find good human acts, you're going to find a corresponding virtue. Now, all human acts aim at either right reason or the good, right? So if you're dealing with or God, if you're dealing with the theological virtues, the end, the proper object, is God. If you're dealing with the other virtues, you might be dealing with reason, right? So justice, for example, is about right reason. Fortitude is about right reason. So the cardinal virtues are aimed at reason, and the theological virtues are aimed at God, which are both good, which is why they're virtues. Now, St. Thomas does point out that we've already talked about in the Prima Secundae, well, I haven't filmed it yet, but in the first section of the second book, that hope is also a passion, right? There's a certain amount of hope that is theological, but there is also hope in terms of the passions. And this makes some sense, because if you say, well, I hope I win the lottery, well, that's very different than saying, I hope to have eternal happiness with God, right? There's a big difference between eternal happiness with God and I hope to win the lottery, or I hope I get that job promotion, or I hope there's a parking spot at the front of the grocery store, right? These are very different things than eternal happiness. So you can't just call all of it hope, although the name is hope, but you have hopes of the passions, which can be achieved with human achievement. And then there are theological virtue of hope, which, as the definition points out, requires divine assistance. So if this is something you can do on your own, passion hope, right? The passion of hope. If it's something you cannot do on your own, we're talking about the theological virtues, right? So eternal salvation is an obvious one, right? Can you obtain eternal salvation on your own? No, right? Only through the grace of God. Therefore, it is theological. I hope I get an A on my math test. Could I do that on my own? Yes, right? So just the passion of hope. Now, hope, is it aimed at eternal happiness? And some of these answers are quite short. But let's not make it more difficult than it needs to be when it's an easy question and an easy answer. We hope in God. We hope in infinite goodness, right? So when we hope in God, we hope for infinite goodness, because God is infinite goodness, right? You can't hope for God and hope for bad or evil, right? That doesn't make any sense. Since God is goodness, infinite goodness, when you hope in God, you hope in infinite goodness. So when you obtain God, right? When you attain God, you attain eternal happiness, because God is goodness and happiness, right? So when you have that infinite goodness, you obtain eternal happiness, and if you obtain God, you obtain both, right? So Yes. So this is very in line with Aristotle, right? Eudaimonia, the final end for Aristotle is happiness, right? Eternal happiness. The same for Thomas Aquinas is very Aristotelian in that approach. The next one is, can you hope for another person's eternal happiness? Now this might seem a little kind of a funny question. Can I hope for somebody else's eternal happiness? And St. Thomas, he points out that in an absolute way, in a direct way, no, you can't. Because hope to obtain this difficult thing, right, eternal salvation, to really hope it, right, as in terms of a virtue, divine assistance, would take all of your energy. I guess it would be fair to say, right? To really have that level of desire, it would be for you, right? For you. Now, could you hope for another person's eternal happiness? Well, he says, yeah, in a different sense, yeah, we can. We can desire other people have it, but in this regard, he kind of points out two different things with it. One is, you hope that other people are able to obtain what you obtain. So you wouldn't desire another person's eternal happiness if you also didn't have hope in it for yourself, right? So it's not, I hope John over here attains eternal happiness, but I don't want any for myself. That really wouldn't make any sense. It would be a sharing, right? There would be a collaboration, a sharing in this eternal happiness, right? To share an eternal happiness with them, right? I guess there's a better way to say it. But he says, St. Thomas says, this really is done through love, right? So how can you hope for this happiness for another? Because you love that person, right? That's how, this seems somewhat clear. Would you want your children to have eternal happiness? Yes. Why? You love them, right? Kind of straightforward. Or your spouse or a family member or a close friend. Would you want them to have faith, hope, and love? Well, of course. Why? Because you love them, right? This is somewhat obvious. Could you want it for a stranger, right? Could you want it for somebody you've never met before? Yeah, agape, right? Loving another for their own sake, right? Willing the good of another, right? There's nothing contrary to hoping others have hope, right? There's nothing against that. Missionaries would do that out of love, going to the furthest ends of the earth to bring the gospel, to spread faith, hope, and love, right? To strangers they haven't met yet, right? But they would be doing it out of love, right? So this makes some sense. Good conversation piece would be about the first part, the absolutely one. Can you absolutely will eternal happiness for the other, right? Is it still hope or is it only desire, right? And, is there a difference, right? St. Thomas points out that there is a difference. Now, in Article 4, St. Thomas brings up, can we hope in men, right? Can we hope in somebody other than God? And probably immediately what comes to mind is something like the line from Jeremiah, cursed be the man who trusts in men, right? We do not trust in men, but we trust in God alone, right? These are the things we hear, right? We can see this in a practical sense too, when people put all of their trust in their parish priest or their minister or their bishop or whoever it is, and they fall short, and then they are devastated because of this. But say, well, we don't put our trust in men, we put our trust in God, right? Even if Father Mark is a very great priest. He's still a priest. He's not Jesus. He's not God, right? So we don't put our trust in Father Mark, no matter how good he is, right? He's not the Messiah. He just points to him, right? Different than sacramental theology, different question. But in terms of the person, Father Mark, is he? Do we put our hope in him? No. The principal cause, St. Thomas points out, and this can get somewhat convoluted, but I think I've simplified it enough. The principal cause of hope is God and eternal happiness in God, right? Part 1, part 2, united in the same, right? God and eternal happiness with God. That's our principal cause of hope, right? Because we're hoping in God, right? Secondarily, right, that's the final cause is God, right? Eternal happiness. The efficient cause, right? The instrument in which, how do we get there, right? How do we get there by instrumental? Well, our primary efficient cause is God again, right? God also causes us to seek hope, right? But secondary instrumental agent could be somebody like the saints, right? Could Maximilian Kolbe give me hope? Well, yeah, because he's pointing at the principal cause, which is God, right? So since Maximilian points to God, Maximilian Kolbe can give me hope. Now, it makes some sense to say the saints rather than a living person, because they have already been tested and have passed the test, right? If we say Father Mark, well, Father Mark may have been very trustworthy up to this moment, but he is not dead yet, so we don't know what will happen next week, right? But we do know what will happen next week with Maximilian Kolbe, right? Yeah. That leg of the story is over, right? So we don't have to worry about him falling short at this point. Or St. Francis or any of the great saints, right? We can look at them and they point to the principal cause, and that can give us hope, especially if they undergone any type of trials that we might be undergoing ourselves, right? Persecution or illnesses or whatever our own struggles are. The saints can point us to the path that they have already walked towards the cross, right, and resurrection. So we can as a secondary cause, we can hope in men, but not our final. It's not a final end, and it's safer to use the saints than somebody living. In terms of questions 5, is hope a theological virtue? Again, this should be fairly straightforward, since in the first letter to the Corinthians, faith, hope, and love, right? I'll put it right there together. St. Gregory points out that the 3 daughters of Job were symbols of faith, hope, and love, the theological virtues. A lot of patristic texts talking about this in Scripture. But yes, and the reason why we can say this, not other than just saying, well, authority figures have said this, if we want to look at it logically, since the final end is God and hope, right? What's the final end in what's the final end of hope? God and eternal happiness in God, right? Through divine assistance, right? So God and eternal happiness with God through divine assistance. Well, what's the purpose of hope? God. Well, that's theological, right? That's theological. Right? It might be different if you're talking about commutative justice, for example, which is in the a couple chapters ahead in a cardinal virtue, right? So what's the point of commutative justice? Well, living well together as a society, right? So that's different, right? Living together as a society is not, the end is not ultimately God, versus faith, hope, and love, where very obviously the end is God. Now, is hope a distinct theological virtue? Well, this is another, St. Thomas says this a dozen times. You don't have a different number and call it the same thing, right? It's you don't have a different number without distinction, right? It has a different name because it means something differently. Otherwise, if hope meant the exact same thing as faith, then you would just have one word for that. You wouldn't have two different words for one concept. So clearly there's a distinction already off the bat. St. Thomas goes into some very clever and interesting detail. You could meditate on these words a bit. You can always look at the slide and pause it if you'd like to do that. But St. Thomas says, faith makes us adhere to God as the source of knowledge of truth. Right? The source of knowledge of truth. We adhere to God. That's what faith is, right? Which, if you don't remember any of this, look at questions 1 through 16, which I've already filmed. Right? Faith is saying yes to the truth, right? Both earthly things and things unseen, right? The unseen is the particular parts that deal with faith. But it's acknowledging the truth, right? That the faith has been proposed and you assent to the faith, right? You assent to what has been proposed, which is the truth, right? So, since we believe that what God tells us is true, right? That's the reason behind it. Now, the second part, while hope makes us adhere to God as the source whence we derive perfect goodness. So, faith is dealing with truth, and hope is dealing with perfect goodness, right? Some ways we're looking at perfect truth versus perfect goodness, right? These kind of extended transcendentals, right? And he says, we trust in the divine assistance for obtaining happiness, right? So the first one, we believe what God tells us is true, and in hope, we trust in the divine assistance for obtaining happiness, right? We allow God to help us in becoming happy. Again, we could probably reflect on these for hours, but that answers the question, right? Are they different? Yes, they are different, right? Article 7, does hope, yes, does faith follow hope, precede hope, or does hope precede faith? The answer is kind of easy with this one, that hope follows faith, right? So faith comes first. Faith, hope, and love. Faith comes first. Why? Because you're hoping in God. If you don't have faith in God, right? You don't believe in God, then what on earth does it mean to have hope in God, right? You can't have hope in something you don't believe in, right? So that's quite an obvious one, right? It doesn't make sense to hope in something. You hope in something, and then you say, well, then comes faith. Well, faith in what, right? The last one, the other part of the question would be, does hope precede charity, right? Faith, hope, and love. Charity is another name for love. And this one's more complicated. So St. Thomas goes on for a bit for this, so this, again, is pretty simplified, but one's first hope is in selfish self-preservation. That's what he says. So the first thing we hope in is not to burn in hell, right? We hope to obtain eternal happiness, right? Why do we want to obtain eternal happiness? Well, who doesn't, right? If you had the choice between eternal happiness, partial happiness, unhappiness, what would you like? Well, eternal happiness sounds better than temporary happiness, and temporary happiness sounds better than eternal punishment. So, but ideally, what would I hope for? Eternal happiness. Why? Well, that sounds better, right? It's just very selfish thing, right? It's a selfish thing. Why? Do you want to burn in hell, or do you want to spend eternity in heaven? Well, all the same. I think I'd rather go to heaven, right? But then there's hope. Right, so why do we hope? Because we want to go to heaven, right? We want eternal happiness. We want to be with God. But then St. Thomas points out is over time, it kind of leads into charity, right? The more you dwell with God, the more you dwell in goodness, the more you experience that eternal happiness, the more your love expands, right? The more charity expands. That's how you know it's a theological virtue, right? Because your love expands when you experience it. If your love does not expand, then it might be a sign that you don't really have faith and hope, right? Just an idea. But then from your experience of charity now, right? Right, we even see this in faith, right? Faith was an intellectual virtue, right? I believe, right? But then in an external form, faith is expressed in love, right? Faith manifests, right? Quickened is love. So the same thing, I guess, with hope, right? Hope could be this, like intellectual virtue, right? I have it, I possess it, right? I have hope. But once you have internalized it, hopefully it pours out of you and it becomes an expression of who you are, in which case it will express itself in charity, right? Charity will flow from faith and hope. Now, when we have that charity, it perfects our hope, right? Now it perfects the hope once we have the charity. So faith and hope came before charity, but once you obtain charity, charity perfects faith and hope, right? So charity comes last, but it also then becomes first in terms of perfection, right? So what does it mean then that hope is perfected? Well, now I want to go to heaven, not because I'm afraid of the fires of hell. Might be afraid of the fires of hell, but that's not my main reason, right? Is it to get a giant mansion in heaven and to show off and say, see, I'm better than all those people in the little shacks down there in heaven? Well, that might be that selfish preservation that might have first initiated some of this, right? But once you have hope with charity, you hope because of love of God, right? You hope because of love of neighbor, because you want to have that eternal happiness in God, not just eternal happiness, but eternal happiness in God, right? And if you had to pick between God or happiness, you would say God, right? But when you pick God, you get eternal happiness. If you pick happiness for happiness' sake, then it's probably not. Okay, so this, I apologize for if any of this was confusing. Feel free to ask questions. I also have a link to the Summa for question 17 in the description in the bottom. I hope that's helpful for anyone who wants to read it. In conclusion, hope is a virtue. Second, the object of hope is eternal happiness. Right? You could say God, eternal happiness in God. I like that. I think you have to throw God in there, not just eternal happiness, because happiness in our modern world is just so much about hedonism, and we're not talking about hedonism. We're talking about God, eternal happiness in God. You can hope for another's happiness, right? Not absolutely, but indirectly. Hope is in God, although as a secondary agent of it, you could hope in the saints because they point to God. Hope is a theological virtue because its end is God. Hope is distinct from the other theological virtues and all other virtues because it aims at something kind of specific. Faith precedes hope, right? And then hope precedes charity, but charity perfects hope, right? And really, charity perfects hope, faith and hope, right? That's, I think, fair enough to say. Okay, next we will get into the subject of hope. Again, only 5 questions here, so total, right? This is 1. So this will go through very quickly, this section. Okay, have a great week.